Location Warlock is a new deck from the mini set The Great Dark Beyond. The idea behind the deck is you want to be activating your different locations to then be able to get your Sea Giant online early. Sea Giant is an 8 mana. Seaside Giant is a 10 mana 8/8 minion, but whenever you use a location, so you activate a location, it reduces its cost down by 2. And by using the different locations that are in this deck, you're able to reduce it down to a very low cost or for free in the very early turns of the game. The cards that you want to be mulliganing for in this deck is Spawning Pool, because it allows your Seaside Giant setup, but it also establishes some board presence. Ultralysk Cavern, because it deals some AoE damage, but it's also getting you your giants. And then if you do have one of those two locations in your hand, you can get your Seaside Giant too. The things that you want to do with this deck, or the combos that are involved with this deck, you can use Consume on your Ultralysk Cavern, and this will then make it so that you get the giant out 2 turns earlier because of the fact that it doesn't need to skip for the second turn. But something that you do need to consider about when you do use Consume is that it doesn't add towards your Seaside Giant proc. Another thing that's really useful in this deck is you can use the Forge of Wills, and this will allow you to summon a copy of your giants, and then that obviously gets some big stats onto your board as well. The idea is then that you're able to overwhelm your opponent with a bunch of rushing giants that are able to trade very well into your opponent. And then a finishing card of this deck is Kerrigan, which is then able to get a bunch of different other Zergs that are able to go into your hand. And then you can also use the hero power to be able to buff up your different to deal damage to your opponent's face using it. So going into the gameplay, you'll see that it's turn 4 now, and I've just played down my Seaside Giant, so I've had access to it quite early. I have made sure that I'm, dealing with my opponent the best that I can, that I'm trading into them. And I draw into the Putrid, which is really good for me to be able to deal with the stealth minion that they have. I don't want them to have the stealth minion on the board just because they could potentially end up getting the Archon out. They end up just dealing some damage to my face, and then they just end their turn, so they equip their weapon and then end their turn. I do have 2 of the caverns on the board as well, which is obviously quite good for me. I set off both of my caverns so I can get them ready early, ready next, and then I get a fracking. So for fracking, I have a few choices. I have the Domino Effect, Consume, and Table Flip. With them having nothing on the board, and just in general, Consume being a decent pickup, I do choose that. Some of the frackings that you will see in this gameplay footage is you'll see that they are a lot more difficult than that, and it's something that I've just been thinking about more and more about if fracking's actually a very good card. Like, it's definitely a card that you don't want to keep in your mulligan. And you'll see that with the applied pressure of those giants, it's too much for my opponent, and they end up conceding. So going into the next game, I'm playing against a Druid, so it's either going to be the Hero Power Druid or Dungar Druid, so both matchups you will choose similar sorts of cards. The Glacial Shard obviously could be useful for Hero Power Druid, but it's not worthwhile keeping in your opening hand when you are trying to get those giants out easily and also try and get your locations. Because the 2 cards in particular that you do want to have in this matchup, or in pretty much any of the matchups, is Spawning Pool quite early, and then your Ultralysk Cavern, because they can obviously get you to have those locations started to be popped to be able to access the Seaside Giant. But also with the Spawning Pool, you're able to get rush minions for your different Zerg minions. I do play down the Zergling and the Harp, both of which I am just playing down because I won't be able to access them for a few more turns considering my hand that's here. I do have access to the Worm and also the Cavern. I find that the Cavern being activated earlier than playing the Worm down is a lot better, because obviously it gets some cards onto the board for me, but it also means that my opponent then has to be considering their different options. You'll notice that they use Elfurian's Gift to get Wild Growth, which does sense to me that they are going to be using Dungar Druid, because they just ramped up rather than using their hero power. So I do just apply some more pressure to them by putting down my Glacial Shard. I also didn't use the Consume then, because it's no point, just in case they do deal some face damage to me, something like a Swipe. And then it's a free card anyway. If it wasn't free, I would consider not playing. I would consider playing that down earlier, but I just opted not to. I end up using the consume here to get out my other, to get out my giant. I also activate the cavern just to get it onto the board. They have used a trail mix in the previous turn, so it's quite likely they will be accessing Dungar this turn. They end up just playing down their Thunderbringer, so Thunderbringer is a card that you don't particularly want to be trading into, and with the draw of the Bob the Bartender that I do here, I end up just putting it into my hand, because they did have a coin in their hand, which signals to me that they don't have a 9-drop that's good enough for them to be playing, such as Ziliax or Dungar. So just getting that out of their field is very good for me, because it means that they won't be able to get access to their 2 8/8s that they would have in their deck. They end up playing down the Prison of Yogg-Saron, so I haven't seen this card being played in a long time. They also use the coins that I just gave them, and then they're going to use the Prison onto my 8/8, so it does mean that obviously it's dealing a little bit of damage to my board. They aren't able to get the full effect of their different buffs that are there, but they do get all the rush minions, which are then able to trade into my minions quite easily. I'm pretty sure it is able to do a full trade. Yep, so they end up trading. They deal all the damage onto my minions, and then they get rid of Bob. It does leave one Zergling alive, but obviously that doesn't really mean too much because it's only a 1/1, and I don't have extra buffs that come from this deck with the like Infestor or things like that. So they end up just using a coin here. It gets them their seedlings, so they're able to draw through some more cards. But also they are on quite a low health total, so that's something else that they're considering right now with their options. And they end up obviously getting rid of those cards that ended up coming temporarily from the pack. I do have access to my Seaside Giant here, so I can obviously establish it down on the board. I am just going to play down my... I'm just deciding here whether to play down my Carrigan or my token, just because of the fact that with Carrigan, I would be wanting to use it with the hero power, but I am also thinking about how I'm going to make sure that my I can attack next turn into my opponent's minions, and I also do want to potentially get a Viper to be able to deal with some scary minions of theirs they potentially may have. They end up just using a Discover card there, so it does... it does end up healing them up a little bit, so they'll be able to survive a little bit longer. And with it healing 9, it does show to me that it is the Dungar that they more than likely would have grabbed. They're using their Innovating Coin, and then they get Artanis out, so this will put them up to a big enough health total to be able to deal with my damage that I can do to them. They do trade into my Zergling as well here, so I'm now just looking at what cards I end up drawing. I get a Spawning Pool, and I also get 2 of the Taunts, so they're not particularly useful. I also use the Worm to be able to get my Consume out of my deck, to be able to trade easier into the minions with the hero power buff. And I'm going to use the hero power buff before I do trade into them, since I do have a bunch of 1/1s. I also am playing down the 1/6 just so I can get some more damage used with my hero power. And I do trade into the 3/2 there, which it just means that I can deal a little bit more damage to my opponent, but in reality it probably was better just holding it so I could keep my guy a little bit more alive. It doesn't really matter too much though, because if they do play something like Yogg down onto the board, it will mean that I would lose probably this whole board anyway. They end up getting Ziliax and Yogg and their Stargazer out of their deck, and this obviously was something that I was assuming would be the case. Them getting Ziliax does mean that they can trade into my minions if I had any, but it doesn't end up being the case. And then they end up getting a bunch of draw cards with their Yogg, and it leaves them with nothing on the board. They do need to get some armor out, otherwise they'll end up potentially losing. They use their Yogg onto me, the Prison of Yogg-Saron, and unfortunately, because they used it on me, it ends up just killing them. So, it was a little bit silly. Like, I didn't really understand the point of them doing that, but obviously that ended up getting them to lose. I play down my I'm playing against a Shaman in this game, so Shaman actually is a relatively decent matchup for this deck as well, because you're able to get those big giants out, and if your opponent doesn't have any lock-ons, they won't be able to deal with the giants very easily. So I end up obviously keeping the spawning pool, and I put everything else away. So turn 1 at this current point in time is obviously going to be playing spawning pool, and turn 2 will be the worm, unless I draw into the cavern, which would then be playing the cavern down. I end up drawing it to Ziliax, so obviously it's not very important for me there, and I just use my, I just tap the location. Right now I'm obviously deciding whether to do the Zerglings, but it's not really necessary. Like, since I have access to the worm, it's more important to be able to use that and actually make use of my mana next turn, otherwise, instead of just hero power. They end up just dealing some damage to face, because if I hadn't have drawn how I did, it would have obviously been better for me to do that. I end up getting the cavern out of my deck, so now that I've got access to one of my caverns, I also do have some healing through the consume as well. Next turn's always going to be playing down the cavern to be able to deal with the 1/1 that's there on their board, and it more than likely will be using a consume, but I also draw a Glacial Shard here, which can be useful as well to make sure that I trade into them. So with the Glacial Shard, it is obviously going to be the best way to deal into them. And right now I end up putting it onto the 3/3 just because of if they potentially have a backstage bouncer, it's something that could be a bit concerning for me. They could trade and then go backstage bouncer and obviously get full value from it. By having it on the Murloc, it means that they can't use the backstage bouncer to trade in very easily. Like, they would trade, but they'd lose it, so it means that they can't just trade into my minion there. That's the reason why I chose that play. I have the other cavern inside of my hand, and I also do have access to the domino effect, so right now I'm just thinking of how I'm going to limit my damage. It would have been nice to be able to play the cavern, but I didn't really want to take that much damage from my opponent, especially since I'm down to 18 health. They end up getting a playing down their delicious cheese to get a bunch of 3-drops. With the Frothing Berserker, it does make it a little bit scary. They end up also putting down their Murloc to be able to trade into me as well. They trade into my Zergling, and then the Missile Pod, I believe, also trades into the other Zergling. And then their Frothing Berserker currently is a 6/4. I draw into my worm here, so I'm just trying to decide what the best way to go about it is going to be. So using both of the caverns means that I can just trade my Zerglings into the Frothing Berserker to be able to get rid of it from the board. Then I can use the Consume to be able to get rid of the 3/1, and it also obviously heals me back up, and it leaves my opponent without anything sitting on their board. So with that, it obviously turned around the board state that they had. I don't really have too much happening in my hand right now as well. They play down their Horn of the Windlord, so it is obviously able to clear my giant quite easily, but it means that in a future turn I'll be able to set up relatively decently. I do also draw onto the Seaside Giant as well, which is quite good for me. It means I can get my Karrigan online a lot earlier. I end up hero powering first before the Seaside Giant, just in case it's not the play, even though there's not really a situation that I don't need to. And I don't use the Consume before because there's no way that my opponent... the only card that would punish that is if my opponent used Ghost, but it's not a very common card to be included inside of these decks. They end up using a Liftoff and a Starport, so it's obviously quite useful for building up their Starship, but in reality, it's not going to be dealing too much with the Giant that I have on the board. So what I'm trying to get now is I'm trying to get obviously get a Giant on the board, but I'm also thinking about how I'm going to best get my other minions down too. By drawing into the 6-drop that's there, it means that I can get an extra Giant onto the board since I do only have Seaside Giant as a possibility with the other cards. And then I can use the Seaside Giant and also use the Consume to get a bunch of 8/8s down. It means that it's quite threatening to my opponent's board, especially since they didn't use Lock-On on the previous turn. It makes me assume that they don't have access to another Lock-On. And then they obviously end up conceding. Even though they could have obviously survived for that turn, it would have been in a pretty bad situation with them taking all the face damage from it. So I'm playing against another Druid, so once again, the decks that you're considering about when you're playing against Druid is you're playing against either Hero Power Druid or Dungar Druid. The Mulligans are going to be quite similar. I do keep Seaside Giant in this hand as well because of the because I do have the Ultralysk Cavern, and it means that I can access the Seaside Giant a bit quicker. And with Dungar Druid, it is something that you can, building the Giants is very useful against it. I end up just passing my first turn. There isn't particularly a play that I could do. Like, I possibly should have just not kept the Seaside Giant since I didn't have a turn 1 play with the spawning pool. I draw into Carrigan now as well, and I played on my Cavern before I used my Worm, because activating the location's a lot more important than drawing the 3 cards and then just ending your turn. Like, if I had drawn into a spawning pool, it would have been fine doing it that way, but it ends up being a very similar sort of play anyway, but it just means that I have the Cavern online for my opponent. I draw into a spawning pool as well, and also another Cavern, which is really good draws for me. It means that I'll be able to access my Giant next turn if I really want to. They end up just using New Heights, so it's quite clear that they are playing Dungar Druid as well. And then they just hit into my face with their hero power. I end up playing down my I use my hero power first, and then I use my locations. I don't really want to get the Giant online just yet, because I will be able to use the Forge of Wills to be able to access it. And since they aren't accessing their Dungar turn just yet, it's not really a big concern for me to worry about. They do play down their a Defense Crystal, which is, perfectly fine for me, since it means that they aren't using Dungar. They're actually using Starship Druid. And Starship Druid in this particular meta isn't actually that strong. I am just looking currently at my hand that's here. I do play down my Seaside Giants as well. I also get the Forge of Wills onto the board, and then I get my 8/8s ready to go. And I'm right now just playing around MC Tech, so I only have the 3 different Giants onto the board. If they had MC Tech, they would obviously be able to clear my minions a bit easier. They end up getting the Bob out, so it freezes all my minions, and it means that I am not able to trade with the Bob next turn. By activating the Ultralysk Cavern, it does mean that I get an extra rush minion onto the board, and it's not going to be playing around Mind Control Tech now. I just use the table flip here. Like, if they do use a Mind Control Tech, it is a little bit of a problem for me, but in reality, it's just something that I have to deal with. I am just right now deciding about which cards best to keep. Like, all these cards are relatively decent going into the late game. The 2 cards that I'd be keeping is Symphony of Sins or Ziliax. That's the 2 choices that I was having for it. I end up just keeping the Symphony of Sins because it is able to potentially disrupt my opponent from going through their infinite strategy, but it also means that they could lose some key cards from their deck. They end up taking my 8/5, and then they do some trading into my 8/8, but that does leave them quite vulnerable into my going into my next turn, since I am able to deal 16 damage through that. The Mind Control Tech also means that they also, for some reason, left my Zergling onto the board. I do use the Symphony of Sins here, and I'm hoping to hit the remove 6 cards from my opponent's deck, because I'm hoping to hit some key important cards with it. I end up hitting the second Mind Control Tech, so now it means that I don't need to play around another Mind Control Tech, which is really good for me. It also hits one of the cubes as well, which is great for me, because it means that they won't be able to get a bunch of buffs onto a bunch of Ziliaxes onto their board, or a bunch of other, like, it reduces down the likelihood of that. And then I just send all my Giants to go, I send my 2 Giants to go face, and I trade into the Mind Control Tech. They end up using their Starship here. And they also use their second Cubicle, which obviously gets them a little bit more armor. I use my Reverberations onto the Cubicle because I can reduce down the cost that ends up coming from it, and then I can also use my Domino Effect plus my Cavern to be able to deal with their board and send all my damage faced against them. I do now have a board of Giants as well, which is quite strong, and since they didn't play like Yogg-Saron or anything last turn, I assume that they don't have it for this turn. They do end up actually playing down the Yogg-Saron, so I was a little bit surprised that they didn't use it the previous turn, considering that what their field was, but they ended up doing this as their trade. And a little bit unfortunate for me, all my Giants end up trading into each other, and I do only keep the Cubicle alive. And the Hex also went for the 50-50 and it missed their Yogg and hit my one, so it's a little bit unfortunate for that. I do freeze their Yogg-Saron because I do have access to reverberations in my hand that's here as well, and that's quite useful for a future turn if I am able to, if they do play down Ziliax or something like that, because they haven't used the take control of an enemy minion. They end up playing down their Ziliax, which is the reason why I went for this sort of play, to freeze the Yogg-Saron. It keeps it on the board while also meaning that I can get some access to it. They end up trading their Ziliax into one of my Brood Queens, and then I also do lose Bob the Bartender here, which is a little bit unfortunate for that. But with having the reverberations, I am able to steal their Ziliax from them. So I take control of the Ziliax from them, and then I obviously end up drawing the cards. I end up the Yogg effect ends up going activating, and right now I'm just deciding how best to deal with the Yogg. Like, I could potentially just use the Ziliax to trade in, which is what I end up doing, because it means I can send some more damage face towards them. I can't use the 6 damage effect either, and I just don't end up using the Brood Queen. It does mean that I'm going to be overdrawing some cards, but there's not particularly anything that I wanted to do. I didn't really want to use the Consume there because I could potentially still be needing the rush effect of my Zergs against my opponent's board. And drawing, the only other card that I could do is the draw 6 cards, but obviously I'd just overdraw 6 cards, which is really useless. They use their Hydration Station here, but since I did take control of their Ziliax, they aren't really able to do too much with that. And then they just trade into my Ziliax, so it's not something that I'm too worried about. I do end up overdrawing one of my Symphony of Sins, so it's a little bit of an issue coming from that. And a slight misplay, since I was going to play the Lurker down this turn, is I should have just traded one Sneaky Snakes, and then I should have used the other Sneaky Snakes to trade into at that point in time as well. I'm also end up using my spawning pool to be able to access my other minions that are here. I do end up trading into the 3/4 first, just because if Lurker hits, I wanted to hit a minion that is potentially able to die first. I then use my my 2 minions to be able to trade into the 3/2s, and then I use my Mulligan here to be able to trade as well into them. It potentially was better just using the Mulligan by itself, then I'd have access to my hero power, but it's perfectly fine anyway, since I am sitting on quite a dominant board position without them being able to access their Ziliax or things like that. I use the Tentacle Swarm here, and then it ends up not really getting any really important effects. And I don't play down the one drop with the spell, because there are some spells, especially 1-drop spells, that could potentially do some serious damage towards my board, which is obviously not what I want, considering I'm in a winning position. They end up just playing down their Defense Crystal, which isn't too scary for me. I do obviously have quite a decent board to be able to deal with that, and I also have the Forge of Wills. They use their Hydration Station as well, which, once again, isn't really doing too much. Like, it obviously gets some armor, but it's not really doing too much else. And drawing into the Mulligan here does mean that I'd obviously be able to clear if I had access to a spawning pool, which I don't at the moment. I end up just trading into the 3/4 that's here, and my Lurk ends up hitting into the minion that's there. I do use Forge of Wills here as well to be able to deal with it, one of their other minions, to be able to trade into it. Then the Lurk ends up hitting the other one of the 3 drops, the 3 damage ones, and then my with this I can end up using my hero power, because it will mean that I'll trade into the 3/1 quite easily. I play down the Mulligan and then use my hero power, and since I got the extra damage that's here, it is going to be exact lethal, since the Lurker is able to apply for it as well. Yeah, like, it was always going to be a winning sort of situation as soon as I took the Ziliax, because any Hydration Station they wouldn't really be able to use very well. I'm playing against a Druid here, so once again, it is more than likely either going to be Hero Power Druid or Dungar Druid. So the best cards to keep in these sorts of matchups are your locations and things like that. And I am obviously just deciding whether to keep the Forge of Wills, because with Forge of Wills, it means that you potentially could get a bunch of Giants into your opponent and overwhelm them early. I end up just trading it away, just simply because if it is Hero Power Druid, Forge of Wills is going to be too slow for that matchup, and in general, you don't really want to be playing it into other sorts of things that are here. This fracking here also shows the reason why you shouldn't play, you shouldn't mulligan for fracking and keep it in your opening hand, because all these cards are quite decent, especially in this matchup. Spawning Pool's great to be able to access early. Forge of Wills is important in the mid game to be able to access with your giants, and Karrigan's your finishers. So like these are probably three of the worst cards to be able to get through your fracking. So just definitely when you are mulligan, do not keep fracking under really any circumstance, because it's just so it's not a good card. It doesn't apply tempo. It's in general, you don't know what you're playing against, so it is better to just use fracking when you actually know exactly what you're needing to get, and it's more than likely you're at a point in time of the game that you can easily mill some of those cards, and it's not a big choice like that. I end up using my worm here because obviously can get access to the Ultralysk. And next turn I'll be able to use the worm again, and then I'll also be able to play down the cavern too. It does seem like they are going to be playing Dungar Druid since they play down the new heights that are here. And then I also draw into my reverberations. I used the worm first just simply because my other choice is going to be the cavern and then the worm, so drawing the cards first is more important. And I do play down the cavern that I drew first, just so it drew second, just so my opponent could potentially be caught off guard by the second cavern coming out of my hand. They end up using Lotus Blossom, and then they end up it looks like they end up just playing Trail Mix afterwards, so having those two cards does signify that it is potentially going to be a Dungar turn next turn. So I do make sure that I keep my all my cards active and ready to go. This is potentially a misplay that I use here with the Glacial Shard. Like, I did want to apply a little bit of pressure, but it would have been better keeping the Glacial Shard to be able to freeze their potential Dungar turn that they could have. They end up just drawing a card. Once again, I didn't use the Consume because not only is it not getting the full health cost, since it's 0 mana, I can use it at any point in time onto one of my locations. They use the coin and then they get their Dungar out, and unfortunately for them, it only hits one minion, and it's just the Splitting Space Rock. So it shows to me that their hand is full of a lot of different high cost minions. So with the Splitting Space Rock as well, you're able to take advantage of it by making them have essentially a dead board of just small minions and small low-powered minions as well. I end up using the Reverberations onto the 8/8, and then I just trade in with my 2/2 because I want to be able to use Table Flip onto it as well. I use the Table Flip, and obviously it ends up getting rid of it. And the reason why I use Table Flip instead of the Dominoes is because with the Dominoes, especially since they would be going wide with those 2/2s onto the board, it ends up dealing more damage to them across the board, and it means that I can obviously deal a little bit better into it. I do have access to one of my Cavern procs this turn, and I have access to Karrigan. So my idea and thought behind this turn is I want to be able to make it so that Thunderbringer doesn't have as much power coming out of it. And I also want to make sure that I'm able to deal with my opponent's board the best. So I want to make it so it only gets one minion out of it, which is the reason why I use the Cavern first, and then I use the Karrigan. Because if it ended up summoning more than the minions that are there, it wouldn't be too good for me. I do trade the 8/8 there, which wasn't as good as using my Consume and then trading into the Thunderbringer, because it would have meant that I would have had an extra minion alive. Because that Splitting Space Rock would have died anyway into any minion because it had the Reverberations effect, so it would have been better in that situation to have Consumed first and then traded into the Thunderbringer with the Consume minion, and then use the Splitting Space Rock to trade into their minion that came out afterwards. They do end up using Swipe and then trading into my different minions that are here as well. So when you are using Splitting Space Rock and things like that, you don't particularly want to have all the different small ones onto the board. This turn I do have access to my Seaside Giant, so I'm just playing down the Tokener, and it's a little bit of a tricky choice because I do know that Ziliax will be coming out very shortly, simply because of the fact that they didn't play it before. I play down my Seaside Giants, then I just go face into them. Like, normally you choose the Ceaseless Expanse to be able to get the biggest minion, but I'm going into my Ziliax turn next turn, and also I'm just under the general assumption that because they weren't able to get the Ziliax, their next turn will be able to access the Ziliax anyway. I play down all my giants as well, just to be able to get a bigger board. They use their Yogg-Saron to be able to trade into my dudes, like to make them fight into each other. Since I do have access to the splitting space rock, it does mean that I'm able to get my board still going, and it's a wider board as well. The choices that I have here, like I'm just trying to think of the best way that's going to be able to trade into these minions that are here, because I don't currently have a guaranteed onto the board. They still haven't played their Ziliax down as well, so that's something that I need to be considering too. I trade my Ziliax into their Yogg, and then also I just trade into the other of the Taunt minions. Since their Titans currently got stealth on it, there's no point in trading extra minions, because I do want to be able to keep some of the little death rattle dudes, because it potentially might be the damage that I need to be doing for the Ziliax that they'll be having onto their board. Because with their Ziliax, having 1/1s is just as important as having the other sorts of drops. They use their Pendant of Earth, and they also use their hydration station, so that means that they do get access to their access to extra armor coming from the Stargrazer. Since they don't have Ziliax in that hand, though, it does mean that I'm able to deal with them a little bit easier. And right now I'm just thinking of how best to deal with their board in terms of making sure that they don't have access to their other cards. It also showed to me with their Pendant of Earth, they wouldn't have access to any other minions because of the fact that they did have just the one card show up, and I've also already seen both, and it was an 8-drop, and I'd already seen the Thunderbringer and such. And then the other part is that I used the hero power first. Like, it potentially could have been a misplay if one of the things didn't hit the Stargrazer, but it's a 66% chance for lethal. If you're enjoying the content, please like and subscribe, and bye for now.